and concludes that this is the most likely historical context in which the Torah could have been published. 52. Franz Greffenhagen concurs with this view. 53, and notes that most recent studies support a Persian date for the final redaction of the Pentateuch. 12. Since the Elephantine papyri seem to show that the Torah was not yet fully entrenched in Jewish culture by 400 BCE, Greffenhagen proposes that the late Persian period, 450–350 BCE, is most likely. 54. Louis C. Jonker argues a connection between Darius I's DNB inscription and the Pentateuch, particularized holiness legislation. 55. Possibility of a Hellenistic origin. The idea that the Torah may have been written during the Hellenistic period, after the conquests of Alexander the Great, was first seriously proposed in 1993, when the biblical scholar Niels Peter Lemch published an article titled The Old Testament, a Hellenistic Book. 56. Since then, a growing number of scholars, especially those associated with the Copenhagen school, have put forward various arguments for a Hellenistic origin of the Pentateuch. 57. Notably, in 2006, the independent scholar Russell Merklin published a book titled Moses and Genesis, Manigo and Exodus, in which he argued that the Pentateuch relied on the Greek language histories of Moses, 278 BCE, and Manigo, 285–280 BCE, and therefore must have been composed subsequently to both of them. Merklin further argued that the Torah was likely written at the Library of Alexandria in 273–272 BCE, by the same group of Jewish scholars who translated the Torah into Greek around the same time. 58. While Merklin accepts the conventional stratification of the Pentateuch into sources such as J, D and P, he believes that they are best understood as reflecting the different social strata and beliefs of the Alexandrian authors, rather than as independent writers separated by long periods of time. 59. In 2016, Merklin published a second book, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, in which hoped that the law code found in the Torah was heavily influenced by Greek laws, and especially the theoretical law code espoused by Plato in his laws. He further argued that Plato's laws provided the biblical authors with a basic blueprint for how to transform Jewish society, by creating an authoritative canon of laws and associated literature, drawing on earlier traditions, and presenting them as being divinely inspired and very ancient. 60. Philippe Wajdenbaum has recently argued for a similar conclusion. 61. Criticism of Hellenistic origin theories. John Van Setters criticized Merklin's work in a 2007 book review, arguing that Moses and Genesis engages in a straw man fallacy by attacking the documentary hypothesis without seriously addressing more recent theories of Pentateuchal origins. He also alleges that Merklin selectively points to parallels between Genesis and Moses, and Exodus and Manigo, while ignoring major dissimilarities between the accounts. 62. Finally, Van Setters points out that Merklin does not seriously consider the numerous allusions to the Genesis and Exodus narratives in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, including in texts that are generally dated much earlier than his proposed dating of the Pentateuch. 63. Merklin, by contrast, holds that those parts of the Hebrew Bible that allude to Genesis and Exodus must be dated later than is commonly assumed. 64. Nature and extent of the sources. Virtually all scholars agree that the Torah is composed of material from multiple different authors, or sources. The three most commonly recognized are the priestly, P, Deuteronomist, D, and Yahwist, J, sources. Priestly. The priestly source is perhaps the most widely accepted source category in Pentateuchal studies, because it is both stylistically and theologically distinct from other material in the Torah. 65. It includes a set of claims that are contradicted by non-priestly passages and therefore uniquely characteristic. No sacrifice before the institution is ordained by Yahweh, God, at Sinai. The exalted status of Aaron and the priesthood, and the use of the divine title El Shaddai before God reveals his name. To Moses, to name a few. 66. In general, the priestly work is concerned with priestly matters, ritual law, the origins of shrines and rituals, and genealogies, all expressed in a formal, repetitive style. 67. It stresses the rules and rituals of worship, and the crucial role of priests. 68. Expanding considerably on the role given to Aaron, all Levites are priests. Viewed according to P, only the descendants of Aaron were to be allowed to officiate in the inner sanctuary. 69. P.S. God is majestic, and transcendent, and all things happen because of his power and will. 68. He reveals himself in stages, first as Elohim, a Hebrew word meaning simply God, taken from the earlier Canaanite word meaning the gods. Then to Abraham as El Shaddai, usually translated as God Almighty, and finally to Moses by his unique name, Yahweh. 70. P divides history into 4 epochs from creation to Moses by means of covenants between God and Noah, Abraham and Moses. 71. The Israelites are God's chosen people. His relationship with them is governed by the covenants, and P.S. God is concerned that Israel should preserve its identity by avoiding intermarriage with non-Israelites. 68. P is deeply concerned with holiness, meaning the ritual purity of the people and the land. Israel is to be a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. Exodus 19:6. And P.S. elaborate rules and rituals are aimed at creating and preserving holiness. 72. The priestly source is responsible for the entire book of Leviticus. For the first of the 2 creation stories in Genesis, Genesis 1, for Adam's genealogy, part of the flood story, the table of nations, and the genealogy of Shem, i.e., Abraham's ancestry. 73. Most of the remainder of Genesis is from the Yahwist, but provides the covenant with Abraham, chapter 17, and a few other stories concerning Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. 74. The book of Exodus is also divided between the Yahwist and P, and the usual understanding is that the priestly writers were adding to an already existing Yahwist narrative. 75. P was responsible for chapters 25:31 and 35:40. The instructions for making the tabernacle and the story of its fabrication. 76. While the classical documentary hypothesis posited that the priestly material constituted an independent document which was compiled into the Pentateuch by a later redactor, most contemporary scholars now view P as a redactional layer, or commentary, on the Yahwistic and Deuteronomistic sources. 65. Unlike Jan D, the priestly material does not seem to amount to an independent narrative when considered on its own. 77. Date of the priestly source. While most scholars consider P to be one of the latest strata of the Pentateuch, post-dating both J and D, 38. Since the 1970s, a number of Jewish scholars have challenged this assumption, arguing for an early dating of priestly material. 78. A.V. Ihovitz, for example, has forcefully argued on linguistic grounds that represents an earlier form of the Hebrew language than what is found in both Ezekiel and Deuteronomy and therefore predates both of them. 79. 36. These scholars often claim that the late dating of P is due in large part to a Protestant bias in biblical studies which assumes that priestly and ritualistic material must represent a late degeneration of an earlier, purer faith. These arguments have not convinced the majority of scholars, however. 38. Deuteronomist. The Deuteronomist source is responsible for the core chapters, 12:26, of Book of Deuteronomy, containing Deuteronomic code, 80, and its composition is generally dated between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE. 81. More specifically, most scholars believe that D was composed during the late monarchic period around the time of King Josiah, although some scholars have argued for other dates, such as during the reign of Manus, 687-643 BCE, or during the exilic, 597-539 BCE, and post-exilic periods. 539-332 BCE. 81, 82. The Deuteronomist conceives of as a covenant between the Israelites and their God Yahweh. 83. Who has chosen, elected, the Israelites as his people, and requires Israel to live according to his law. 84. Israel is Tova theocracy with Yahweh as the divine suzerain. 85. The law is to be supreme over all other sources of authority, including kings and royal officials, and the prophets are the guardians of the law. Prophecy's instruction in the law is given through Moses. The law given through Moses is the complete and sufficient revelation of the will of God, and nothing further is needed. 83. Importantly, unlike the Yahwist source, Deuteronomy insists on the centralization of worship in the place that the Lord your God will choose. Deuteronomy never says where this place will be, but Kings makes it clear that it is Jerusalem. 83. Yahwist. John Van Setters characterizes the Yahwist writer as a historian of Israelite origins writing during the Babylonian exile, 597-539 BCE. 86. The Yahwist narrative begins with the second creation story at Genesis 2:4. This is followed by the Garden of Eden story Cain and Abel, Cain's descendants, but Adam's descendants are from P, a flood story, tightly intertwined with the parallel account from P, Noah's descendants and the Tower of Babel. 73. These chapters make up so-called primeval history, the story of mankind prior to Abraham, and J and P provide roughly equal amounts of material. The Yahwist provides the bulk of the remainder of Genesis, including the patriarchal narratives concerning Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph. 74. The book of Exodus belongs in large part to the Yahwist, although it also contains significant priestly interpolations. 87. The Book of Numbers also contains a substantial amount of Yahwist material, starting with Numbers 10:14. It includes, among other pericopes, the departure from Sinai, the story of the spies who are afraid of the giants in Canaan, and the refusal of the Israelites to enter the promised land, which then brings on the wrath of Yahweh, who condemns them to wander in the wilderness for the next 40 years. 88. Criticism of the Yahwist as a category. The Yahwist is perhaps the most controversial source in contemporary Pentateuchal studies, with a number of scholars, especially in Europe, denying its existence altogether. 89. A growing number of scholars have concluded that Genesis, a book traditionally assigned primarily to the Yahwist, was originally composed separately from Exodus and Numbers, and was joined to these books later by a priestly redactor. 90. Nevertheless, the existence and integrity of the Yahwist material still has many defenders, especially fervent among them is John Van Setters. 91. History of scholarship. 11th century manuscript of the Hebrew Bible. In the mid-18th century, some scholars started a critical study of doublets, parallel accounts of the same incidents, inconsistencies and changes in style and vocabulary in the Torah. 1. In 1780, Johann Eichhorn, building on the work of the French doctor and exegete Jean Struck's conjectures and others, formulated the older documentary hypothesis, the idea that Genesis was composed by combining two identifiable sources, the Jehovist, J, also called the Yahwist, and the Elohist, E. 92. These sources were subsequently found to run through the first 4 books of the Torah, and the number was later expanded to 3 when Wilhelm de Wet identified the Deuteronomist as an additional source found only in Deuteronomy d. 93. Later still the Elohist was split into Elohist and priestly p. sources, increasing the number to 4.94. These documentary approaches were in competition with two other models, the fragmentary and the supplementary. 95. Fragmentary hypothesis argued that fragments of varying lengths rather than continuous